David and Paul, welcome to the podcast.
G'day, Jackie.
Hello.
David, last week the opposition was highly critical of Albanese for breaking his promise over his tax cut changes, but this week Labor has sort of turned or tried to turn the tables on the opposition, hasn't it?
Yes, because basically what we've got here is a reverse wedge, or what I'm starting to think of as a revenge wedge. Because, of
Sounds
course,
painful.
The coalition put the pressure on Labor 5 years ago by coming up with this big tax plan, and they challenged Labor to back it. And Labor had awful trouble, basically coming to a position where they had to accept these tax cuts. Now, the boot is on the other foot. Labor is doing this to the coalition, saying, we have modified the tax cuts. 11.5 million people are better off. 84% of taxpayers get a bigger tax cut than under the original coalition plan. So you must decide now, will you vote for this or will you try to block it? So that's the revenge wedge. Now, before we go any further, I think we've got to really emphasise the point here that Labor's not in a, total position of strength here. They've just broken a major election promise. That's got a lot of risk for Anthony Albanese personally, because he made the pledge to keep the stage 3 tax cuts as they were. So there's a defensive position for Labor here because they've got to explain their broken promise. And I'm not sure that they've actually won that yet, right? It's early days. However, they are seeking to put that pressure on the coalition. And we did see last week that the coalition had trouble really coming out with a really crystal clear position early on. They weren't sure whether they were going to roll these back. Now they're still not saying whether they will vote for these changes or not. They need time, basically, to come up with their own policy so that they've got a solid foundation for arguing the case in Parliament.
Yeah, we did see that last week. There was a bit of ambiguity, particularly in the position of the Deputy Liberal Leader, Susan Ley. Paul, what is the actual current position of the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, on the tax cuts? Is it possible to enunciate?
Yeah, well, as David said, they don't quite have one yet. Their shadow cabinet met in Perth yesterday morning. That was never going to be a meeting where they flagged that they were going to come out with a concrete position. I think they did discuss it, but it was in kind of broad terms. The shadow cabinet will meet again, I believe, before the sitting week next week, which is when this legislation will be brought forward. The government's moving very quickly, which doesn't leave the coalition with a whole lot of time to think about how they manoeuvre on this long term. It seems pretty likely, and most coalition people you speak to believe that they will back the changes eventually. They will try and amend, and they'll put pressure on Labor for the breach of trust, and they'll say it should have had this element or that element, and Labor's done in this group or that group. But eventually I think it's pretty unlikely they'll stand in the way of it, is what most people believe, but that could be wrong.
And the Nationals are really important here because they represent country communities, and those communities have lower wages than urban communities. And so the clear signal from the Nationals is that they are not going to try and block these tax cuts because a lot of their own constituents are better off. And so I think there's an internal dynamic for Peter Dutton to deal with, where there are some Nationals who don't want to block this. They've got to craft an alternative policy that lets them say yes to bigger tax cuts for 11.5 million people.
Just on that, it's pretty fascinating, and a sign of the political times and like trends across the Western world, that the Liberal Party's reflexive position is to back in tax cuts for higher income earners. But increasingly, and they say this publicly, they want to be the party of the battler. Their electorates they're targeting have lower income people in the outer suburbs, and Labor picks up seats in the inner city now, like the seat of Chisholm and Higgins in Victoria, which take in very wealthy suburbs, Bennelong in New South Wales, where people are actually on those really high incomes. But Labor, the traditional party of the battler, is instinctively in favour of tax cuts for lower income earners. It's quite interesting, that dynamic.
It certainly is, and it's particularly interesting in the context of Peter Dutton's recent comments that he wants the Liberal Party to be the party of working class Australians, of that outer suburban belt. And from everything that he's indicated, he's kind of given up a little bit on the inner urban Teal seats. We'll get to the Teals a bit later, but I do want to ask you a bit more about the Liberal Party room dynamics on this internally. As you've said, the Nats are kind of inclined to support it because they come from sort of lower socioeconomic background electorates. Liberal Party electorates are very diverse in that sense. Some of them will come from richer electorates where there are more people who lose more money under this new plan, and others come from much more diverse electorates. Do we know what the Liberal Party room is saying on this to their leader?
One point that's coming up is that they can clearly do more over time with tax cuts. One of the big differences with the Labor proposal is it actually sort of claws back some tax revenue over a decade. There's a $28 billion difference in the costings in terms of the original coalition costings and the revised Labor plan costings. Some of the discussion on the coalition side is about what to do with that $28 billion. For instance, it's possible for the Liberals to decide they want to be a bit more generous with tax cuts over a decade. I don't think that they can put forward more generous tax cuts over the next year. That's going to be inflationary. They'd cop criticism for coming up with an economically irresponsible plan. But I think the option for Peter Dutton is to be more generous with tax cuts, because that's really where the coalition started here in 2019. That could be where they end up again. There is that internal debate about what to do on the long-term plan, and that then would give them a foundation upon which to explain why they're accepting the Labor law when they seem to dislike it so much.
Where are the Teals in all of this? The so-called Teal independents represent some of the wealthiest electorates in the country, so you would think that they would be opposed to the tax cut changes that take away money from high-income earners. Is that right, or is it not that simple?
It's
Paul?
Not that simple at all. All of the Teals, or at least quite a few of them, have been big campaigners on the idea of, broad-ranging tax reform. A big part of the Teal kind of identity, I'd say, is, an adherence to kind of evidence-based good policy. Or if you talk to any economist in Australia, they've been banging the drum of tax reform for, since Ken Henry's report, further back even. I mean, John Howard is the last Prime Minister who really did proper tax reform. So there's an acceptance across the public policy and political world that you need to do good tax reform. The Teals have taken that up. But interestingly, on the stage 3 tax cuts, which, harm high-income voters, many of whom live in Teal electorates, the Teals haven't come out instinctively and said, no, we must keep these in place. This hurts my voters. Labor's dud in my electorate. They've actually come out and been much more measured than that. Zoe Daniels done a survey of her electorate, which shows that there's quite a high level of support for the changes. Someone who did the survey told me you don't need to actually be in Zoe Daniels' electorate to do it. So I wonder if there's some bias in her surveyed audience there. Yeah, exactly. On the Teal mailing list, which I'd guess would skew considerably left. But yeah, I haven't seen many Teals come out and say these are bad changes. Allegra Spender has not been hugely positive on them, but she's also not slamming them, is my understanding.
She's got a really interesting position because she's very much in favour of significant tax reform. And this highlights the Teals do all come to this from a different point of view. Allegra Spender's been talking for some time now, more than a year, about tax reform. She has an economic agenda, not just the sort of the unifying Teal agendas of climate, integrity, and other issues. Whereas Monique Ryan appears to have been much more positive about these Labor changes to stage 3 than Allegra Spender. So there are differences there. I'm not sure whether that plays out in a significant way in the House of Representatives. But they all have to navigate this very carefully because there's no question for all those Teals, they have to explain to their constituents why they're going to be, where they're going to stand on a change that reduces tax cuts for many of their own constituents.
Paul, there is a by-election coming up in the Victorian seat of Dunkley on March the 4th, and the tax cut changes are very much playing into that. Can you just first of all tell us a little bit about that electorate for those listeners who won't know it?
So this electorate centres on the Bayside city of Frankston in kind of outer southeastern Bayside, Victoria. It's probably I haven't looked at a map, but it's probably about 35 kilometres from Melbourne city centre. Frankston is kind of a place that a lot of Melburnians know and have stereotypes about. It's nicknamed Franger. It's known for has an old school, probably offensive stereotype as being a place where there's quite a lot of crime and pockets of disadvantage. But that has changed a bit over the last decade or so. The state Labor government there, which has flipped all previously Liberal seats to being strong Labor seats in that area. They were usually like super marginal and super important for elections. They're now very safe Labor. They've invested super heavily in schools and transport and train stations, and they've built up big margins in those seats, the Labor Party now. It's a heavily mortgaged area. The average income is almost bang on the average Australian income. Lots of vocational education workers, TAFE students, teachers, essential services workers. There are some newer suburbs which are kind of, very, very heavily mortgaged, like big new greenfields areas. And then right at the bottom of the electorate, there's some pockets of wealth where it's a higher Liberal vote. And one suburb there almost voted for a Teal candidate at the state election. So that place will be a real test of whether Peter Dutton in Victoria, where he's quite unpopular, can win back kind of former Liberal voters. So this is a place where the stage 3 tax cut debate will really play out. And because this electorate reflects many of the electorates around the country, it'll be super important.
The internal data from the Labor campaign is that 87% of the taxpayers in Dunkley are better off under the Labor plan. So, it's 84% nationwide. It's slightly more in Dunkley. So they think that that's a winner for them. But it was interesting on Thursday morning when Anthony Albanese was asked on radio, is the Dunkley by-election a referendum on your tax plan or a test of your tax plan? And he said, no, it's not. People will vote on a whole range of issues. But I think as a Middle Australia seat with that kind of demographic, it's a really crucial test. It tests the Labor tax plan, it tests Albanese on his broken promise, and it tests Peter Dutton on whether he really is a leader for working Australians, for the working class.
Albanese is obviously trying to reset, as we're talking about, and he's hired a high-profile press gallery journalist for his office just this week, and that's Catherine Murphy, who's been the political editor of The Guardian Australia since its inception in 2013. So is Albanese is this shake-up of the office, is that just coincidental, or do you think he needs to shake up his messaging and there's some sort of strategy reset in the heart of the PMO? David?
We aren't seeing it as a strategic reset yet. Maybe there are more smarter plans afoot, but I think, and I've written this and I've said it, the Prime Minister's office is needed to lift its game. This year is a really crucial year for the government because it's when they get measured on delivery. It's when they prep for the next election. It's when they end up with more baggage as they go on, because inevitably for a government in this situation, after winning power, they can't deliver everything they do. We'll find policies and programs where they don't meet their targets and they'll be measured on that. So they need a sharper and stronger Prime Minister's office. And I think that's part of the appointments here. Catherine Murphy's, well experienced, would be very trusted by Anthony Albanese. Fiona Sugden has joined. She was part of the team that took Labor into power in 2007, a very good operator. And they've promoted Brett Mason, who's also very reliable. Now, I have problems with the Prime Minister's office at times. I've said this and I've written it, but I think we can see this as a sign that Anthony Albanese knows they've got to be more effective. And I think that's that is what's at work here.
Paul, what did you make of this high-profile hiring?
I don't know Catherine anywhere near as well as David does, but I think the only thing I can offer is a comparison between another political office I've worked around, which is the office of Daniel Andrews when he was Premier. I reported in Victoria for a while. That was one of the most proactive, big agenda-setting offices, I think, in modern probably political history. It was huge. It was bigger than the Prime Minister's office at the time. In Daniel Andrews' office, just to offer an insight to listeners to how political offices work, their media advisors would call each of the newspapers at about 2 or 3 o'clock, and they almost aggressively asked to know what was being written by each journalist, what the angle was, and what the top of the story would say. And kind of over a period of, I think just the pressure on that approach got to a point where we actually just submitted to it often, just to kind of get them off our backs, and we'd tell them exactly what was being written. I came up to Canberra last year and there's just nothing of the sort here. And I was struck by how little I ever had to do with the PMO. They seemed almost disinterested at times with what the gallery was doing. That seems to be changing a little bit.
I would say they've been too passive, and I think that's been bad for them. I also think that Peter Dutton's office is quite passive as well. And when you get closer to an election, you think surely that's going to change on both sides.
Maybe the newspapers just don't matter anymore, David.
Well, I think that they do. I'm biased on that. But it is an open question about how both leaders will try and use the media over the next year. We know that Anthony Albanese loves to talk to FM radio and does that all the time. That's part of what he does. Peter Dutton talks a lot to people where they want to hear what he's got to say, and he's going to agree with them. Sky News, Ray Hadley on 2GB. Whether he changes his media strategy is one of the mysteries of the year ahead.
If there are any political staffers from the PMO listening to this, just pick up the phone. We're always here.
I should just add to that.
Be careful what you wish for.
There are some really top-level staffers in this government. I don't think any of these comments are a reflection on any of the individuals.
They're good people. I mean, they do their job. Good luck to them.
It's an approach, and I mean, I think Samantha Maiden, a very influential journalist, said on Insiders that, and I've heard this as well from people in the government, that approach from the PMO might just be a function of the PM himself.
Oh.
He likes doing things himself.
Look, since we're getting into the whole thing about how officers work, all officers reflect the leader.
Yeah.
So the person at the top sets the culture of that office. And I think a lot of the questions about the Prime Minister's office come back to the question, does Anthony Albanese tell them what he's planning? Does he brief them on anything he's doing so that they can actually go out there and help to sell what the government's up to?
And he's been in politics in Parliament for such a long time, and he has personal relationships with a lot of journalists, and he has a very casual style too. So yeah, perhaps they find it difficult to corral him rather than vice versa. Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was very insightful as always, and we look forward to having you both back on next week, if not the week after or the week after that.
Cheers, Jackie.
Thanks, Jackie.
Cheers.
Bye.